It's a Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio, and Kyle is doing what 40 million Americans do without a second thought, topping off a half-empty tank for a little over $3 a gallon before heading 25 minutes down the interstate to work. He doesn't think about it. Gas is just gas. 3,000 miles away in Stuttgart, Lucas is watching the numbers climb on the same kind of pump. By the time he's done filling up, he's paid the equivalent of over $9 a gallon for the exact same tank of fuel. That number is usually where the conversation stops. $9 a gallon sounds insane, and it's the first thing Americans bring up when they imagine owning a car in Germany. Total financial nightmare, right? But gas is actually the smallest and most misleading piece of this puzzle. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the real cost of owning a car here doesn't line up with what that pump price seems to promise. I'm Justin. I've lived in Germany for over 12 years now, long enough to register, insure, and drag more than one car of mine through this country's brutal inspection system. I'm not going to give you tourist brochure guesses. These are real numbers from someone who's actually paid them. If that's the kind of channel you're into, hit subscribe, because we break down a different piece of German versus American cost of living every single week. Here's the myth. Gas costs 3 times as much in Germany. So obviously, owning a car here costs 3 times as much overall. Here's the reality. Fuel is just one line item in a system that's built completely differently from the American one. And once you add up all the pieces, the gap is nowhere near what that pump price implies. And to be fair, the steelman version of the myth is real. Paying over $9 a gallon isn't some rounding error or a currency conversion trick. It's genuinely that expensive. It hurts every single time you fill up, and if you drive a lot for work, it adds up fast. Anyone who tells you German gas prices aren't a real burden hasn't actually stood at a pump here watching the total spin past what they'd pay back home. That part of the myth is completely true. So let's start with fuel, because the math is more interesting than the sticker price. The average German drives around 12,000 kilometers a year, roughly 7,500 miles, which is noticeably less than the average American's 13,000+ miles, mostly because German cities are denser and public transit actually gets you places. Run the numbers on a typical efficient German car, and you land at somewhere around $2,000 a year in fuel. Run the numbers on a typical American commute, and typical American fuel economy, even at the lower U.S. pump price. You land at somewhere around $1,700 to $1,900 a year. The per gallon price is 2.5 times higher in Germany. The annual bill is only marginally higher. That gap should already be messing with your assumptions. Then there's the inspection every car here has to pass every 2 years. An official roadworthiness and emissions check that costs somewhere around 160 euros or roughly $80 a year averaged out. Fail it, and you're not driving that car again until whatever's wrong gets fixed. Rust, brakes, emissions, lights, all of it gets checked by an independent inspector with zero incentive to wave you through. It's annoying, it's non-negotiable, and yes, it costs money. But spread over 2 years, it's genuinely one of the smaller line items on this list. Insurance is where the story flips completely. In Germany, the mandatory minimum is liability-only coverage, and for most drivers that runs somewhere between 250 and 300 euros a year. Call it $300. If you want more protection, you can add partial or full coverage, which can push your total insurance bill up toward 800 or 900 euros depending on your car and your driving record. Compare that to the US, where the national average for full coverage now sits above $2,600 a year, nearly 9 times what a German driver pays for the legally required minimum. Gas punishes you at the pump in Germany. Insurance punishes you at renewal time in America. There's also an annual vehicle tax here, calculated off your engine size and how much CO2 your car emits, and for a normal mid-size gas car that typically lands somewhere between $80 and $150 a year. Electric cars are exempt from it entirely for the first 10 years. It's not a huge number on its own, but it's one more recurring bill that simply doesn't exist in most American states in this form. And then there's the piece nobody puts a line item on, the American default of just driving everywhere, no matter what. In most of the US, owning a car isn't really a choice. It's the entry fee for participating in daily life. Work, groceries, school pickup, all of it assumes a car exists. That's why AAA's own numbers put the true all-in annual cost of owning a new car in America, once you count financing, depreciation, insurance, fuel, and maintenance together, at over $11,000 a year. Most of that isn't gas. It's the size of the loan, the size of the vehicle, and the fact that there's no real alternative to driving. And here's where it gets interesting, because that flips the whole conversation upside down. Germany's pain shows up loudly once every time you're standing at the pump watching the total climb. America's pain is quieter but bigger. A car payment, a big insurance bill, depreciation on a vehicle you had no real choice but to buy, because the alternative to owning a car in most American zip codes is simply not participating in normal life. Germans pay more per liter. Americans often pay more. They just pay it in smaller, less painful feeling installments spread across 12 months instead of one brutal number at the pump. If you're actually planning a move and dreading untangling German car insurance from scratch, that's exactly the kind of thing I get asked about constantly. I work with a broker who specializes in getting Expat set up fast without losing your no-claims history from back home, and I'll drop a link below. So back to Kyle and Lucas. Kyle's cheap fill-up hides a car payment, a bigger insurance bill, and a vehicle he was basically required to buy because there's no bus that gets him to work. Add it all up, and he's looking at something in the range of $11,000 a year, whether he loves that number or not. Lucas felt real pain at that pump. That part wasn't fake. But between the lower mileage, the cheaper mandatory insurance, and the option to just not own a car at all if he moved somewhere with decent transit, his total, realistically, lands well under half of Kyle's. The $9 number was true. It just wasn't the whole story. So if you're actually dealing with this, here's what I'd do. First, budget the inspection as a lump sum you set aside every 2 years, not a monthly expense. It catches people off guard otherwise. Second, if you're moving from the U.S., get your no-claims driving history translated and documented before you apply for insurance here, because it can meaningfully lower your rate. Third, before you panic about the price per liter, calculate your actual cost per kilometer or per mile. You'll usually find it's a lot less dramatic than the pump number suggests. And fourth, if you're choosing where to live in Germany, seriously consider whether you need a car at all. Plenty of people here go without one entirely, something that's just not realistic in most of the U.S. Kyle's paying less per gallon and more per year. Lucas is paying more per gallon and in a lot of cases, less per year. The price at the pump was never the real story. It was just the number loud enough to distract you from the one that actually matters. If you want more of these real numbers breakdowns, hit subscribe, drop your own experience in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.